Hi, welcome to our Facebook Live event and to our home. I'm Camille Vasca, Mike's wife, and our son Grant is here with us as well. Every week, we invite you into our home to talk about Mike's campaign for Attorney General and the issues that are shaping that race. I'm honored to introduce our guests today. Our guests today are Dan Evans, who is Washington's only three-term governor and who went on to serve in the U.S. Senate. Dan is widely recognized as one of our state's most successful leaders. And we're joined by France Hoang, who came to Washington State as a refugee with his parents in 1975 when he was just a toddler. He's now a successful lawyer, entrepreneur, and combat veteran. He also worked in the White House with President George W. Bush's National Pandemic Plan. And now I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Camille. Unemployment is rising to record heights, and many businesses are failing. The demand at food banks is growing. There is a huge state budget deficit. I could be talking about today and the COVID-19 crisis, but there was another chapter in our state's history when we faced those same challenges. It was the Boeing bust of the late 1960s and early 1970s, when high unemployment, political divisions, and unrest over the Vietnam War tested the mettle of our citizens and its leaders. You may recall the billboard from that time that said, "Will the last person leaving Seattle please turn out the lights?" I think we may have a copy of that. There it is. But our state used that crisis to emerge stronger and more resilient. Our COVID-19 response can likewise be a springboard to a better future for our state. There are a lot of people suffering right now. I talked with two of my neighbors this week about how tough it is to be a small business owner. One owns restaurants, the other a fitness center. They have debts to pay and no money coming in. They feel helpless. I understand that. But they have an opportunity, just like you have an opportunity, to make our voices heard in this fall's election. You have a chance to choose whether our state will come together to solve the big problems caused by COVID-19. And maybe, just maybe, we can begin to make a better, more responsive state government and begin to heal the hyperpartisanship tearing at our democracy. I'm running for Attorney General to put leadership over partisan political agendas, to help solve these tough challenges and to protect the evergreen state. Let me start today's discussion with the year 1976. That year was the bicentennial of the American Revolution. It also was a watershed year for me. It was the year I became an Eagle Scout. It was also just after my father had a stroke and my family relied on food banks for a while. Up until then, my dad was the Energizer Bunny of community involvement, with much of his volunteer time spent on recruiting coaches, building fields, and running the local soccer association. He came to America as a refugee from World War II in Europe when he was a teenager, and this was his way to give back and to bring some hope to our community suffering through the Boeing bust. 1976 was also the year I read a plaque on the wall of the Redmond Community Pool honoring the great leader of the forward thrust movement, Jim Ellis, which through his efforts and a public vote is how the pool got built. The plaque said, "One man can make a difference," and Jim Ellis did. And it was the year I received a letter from Governor Dan Evans honoring my Eagle Scout Award and telling me that I could accomplish anything I set my mind to. That year is when I said to myself, maybe I could do some good things for our community when I get older, like my new heroes, Dan Evans and Jim Ellis. And I've certainly tried to live up to that challenge I made to myself back then as both a civic and political leader. As we begin to think about how COVID-19 will reshape our future, we can learn much from the period, beginning with the Boeing bust in 1969 and ending in 1976. Washington was made better during that period by sparking an entrepreneurial spirit as former Boeing engineers started their own companies. And our state cleaned up its politics, washing away partisan political machines that stood in the way of progress. Our state welcomed new Americans, refugees from Southeast Asia, like France Hoang, who were shunned by places like California, but found refuge here from communist oppression. Our state was guided by extraordinary leaders who were willing to work across the aisle and put aside their partisan ambitions. We'll talk to one in a minute, Governor Dan Evans. I'm running for Attorney General in their footsteps to use my decades of leadership experience to help get our state through the COVID-19 crisis, to make lemonade out of the lemons. First, let's hear from Dan Evans, who was beginning his second term of office as governor in 1969 when Boeing went bust. Dan was my mentor from my earliest days as a community leader, and I owe very much to him for that. Dan, are you with us?
I hope so.
There you are.
Yeah.
How are you doing, Dan?
Well, I've got a little cabin fever like most everyone else does because we didn't realize just how tough it is to be isolated until it happens. And we'll all get through it, but it's not an easy time right now.
Yes, well, at least there are some things we can start to do outside. And I know you and Nancy will take full advantage of that when you can. Now, Dan, in my intro, I talked about the Boeing bust, which happened when you were governor. How bad really was it for those of us that maybe don't remember it?
Well, in early 1968, we had 125,000 employees in Washington working for the Boeing company. About 10 months later, we had 29,000. So it was not only a huge drop in employment, but it was so rapid that it was very, very difficult to keep up with the needs of people that we just hadn't experienced before. Very much like what we're facing now.
And that wasn't the only issue that you were dealing with. Of course, there were also protests, and maybe some would say riots, but certainly protests over the Vietnam War. And I think there were also some racial protests as well. In fact, we might have a picture, the famous picture of protesters marching down I-5 that we can show. Do we have that? Yep, there it is. Dan, can you see that one?
Oh, I certainly can, and I remember
very
it
dramatic.
vividly.
Yeah, what do you remember about, so that on top of the Boeing, the Boeing bust, as we called it, what do you remember about how that added to the complication of governing?
Well, there were actually three huge public interest issues at that time, all cascading over one another. One was the war in Vietnam. The second was about the second phase of the civil rights movement, which was then focused on jobs and opportunity and was pretty intense. And the third was the beginning of the environmental movement, which also drew thousands of mostly young people to a whole new set of circumstances that nobody had thought very much about up to that time.
So lots going on, and in doing a little research on the governor's current use of the emergency powers law, I saw that law was passed when you were governor in 1969. During that time, if I recall correctly, the state Senate was controlled by Democrats and the House by Republicans. And of course, you were a Republican then, so you had divided power and lots of challenges for our state to deal with. How did you manage to get things done back then?
Well, we generally had many get-togethers with the governor and legislative leaders as the crisis grew and as multiple crises faced us. But almost all of those meetings were with the leaders of the four caucuses, the Republican and Democratic caucus in the House and in the Senate. And two of those were led by Republicans, two by Democrats. And the issues were so difficult and the times so problematic that I think that brushed away some of what otherwise might have been a more partisan view of things.
And was that a new development then? Had it been more partisan before the Boeing bust and related issues, Dan, or was that? Oh, go ahead.
You know, I became governor during the year that Barry Goldwater ran against Lyndon Johnson for president, and after the election, there were many newspaper articles written by columnists who said it looks like the Republican Party is on its way out. The defeat was so large that it just didn't look like there was any chance for Republicans. The Republican Party was divided between those who were mostly newer Republicans, or at least they came aboard because they were so enamored with Barry Goldwater and what he was saying. And they overran a lot of the more traditional Republicans who had been in charge or in leadership positions up to that point. So it was a Republican Party that was in dire straits, and yet it was the time when I was elected governor and faced a very strong Democratic majority in both the House and the Senate, and the necessity of trying to govern during a very difficult time.
So are you saying that's when you and your fellow Republicans learned the habit of working across the aisle to get things done because you didn't have much power back then?
Well, the very first issue that came before us was a federal court requirement that we redistrict before we could pass any other bill in the legislature during that session. So we started with the session started. The Democratic legislative majority passed a redistricting bill within the first 3 or 4 days. I quickly vetoed it. And about 10 or 15 days later, they passed a second one, which I also vetoed. And then they got down to work, and the pressures grew substantially because nothing else could be done until finally they got together in a bipartisan way. And I was directly involved with the bipartisan meetings, many of them. Ultimately, we reached a bipartisan agreement. It was passed by the legislature with pretty handy majorities, and I signed it quickly. And of course, 2 years later, we gained 16 seats in the House of Representatives and took control for the first time in a decade.
Okay. So in the Boeing bust, you had bipartisanship. People came together. You learned a lot of lessons, undoubtedly, from that experience. What advice would you give to the voters and to our leaders today as to the kinds of leadership qualities you think are needed for our public officials to bring you out of this COVID-19 crisis? I guess it's kind of a two-part question. What advice would you give to the voters? What should they be looking for? And the second question is, what advice would you give to those who are either in office or seeking office during this election cycle?
Well, the COVID crisis is a different kind, but in many respects, the fallout from the crisis during the Boeing crash and this one were very much the same. Now we'll see what happens as we come out of the COVID crisis. The Boeing crash put statewide unemployment in the state of Washington at over 13% and much higher in King County. And it didn't last for a long time. It was surprising how many people who were laid off at Boeing had been laid off for the first time in their lives. These were not just hourly workers. These were not only the hourly workers, but their supervisors, the engineers, the scientists, the leaders of Boeing. And they were the ones that reached out and started their own businesses. There was an awful lot of new efforts going on to sort of build a new economy and with the lack of the Boeing economy. And as a result, that began the expansion or the broadening of our economy, which prior to that time was timber, fishing, agriculture, and Boeing. And the timber, fish, and agriculture were all expanding, but it was the manufacturing economy that really changed at that time for the better and started us on the road we've been on ever since.
Dan, do you think that entrepreneurial spirit that came as a result of the Boeing bust helped create a climate that allowed Microsoft and some of the early tech companies to really take root here? Do you see are you saying there's a connection between the Boeing bust and now us being one of the world's great tech centers?
Well, it's hard to directly connect I'd love to, but it's hard to directly connect the two together. But there's no question that as the Boeing people left Boeing and started new companies, these companies were mostly in the technical field because that's what the people who started them knew about. And that was the beginning of a new effort and a new direction for the economy in the state of Washington. And of course, I think just prior to that, the one thing that changed Washington from a quiet, rather unusual state was Century 21, the World's Fair, which occurred in Seattle in 1961. That really brought a host of new visitors, new attention to Washington, and it broke us out of a past that was pretty ordinary. And we've never stopped since. We've had our ups and downs in terms of the economy, but it's always been aimed at tomorrow. It's been aimed at inventing and developing new ideas. And it's, I think, out of that deep and sharp recession came the beginnings of a new, broader, better, and stronger state of Washington.
Now I'm going to ask you something that's a little more political. Governor Inslee did not brief the Republican leadership in the state legislature on his plan for reopening the economy, or his outline of a plan, I guess you could call it, which he announced last Friday. What advice would you give to Governor Inslee about how to work with the legislature during a crisis like the one that we're in?
Well, I just think, and I had to discover it by experience, but there are 4 caucuses in the legislature, 2 Republican, House and Senate, 2 Democratic, House and Senate. I had, in the 12 years I was governor, both houses with majorities of Republicans. We had 6 years of Republican majorities in the House, never did have a Republican majority in the Senate. And so that requires some inter-party effort, but I just believed strongly that you let everybody know what you're trying to do, and you never know where some of the support comes. There were occasions during the Boeing crisis when some of the best support I got was from leadership on the Democratic side in the state Senate. So if you open up the opportunity for both parties to be informed and to take part, it's amazing the change that makes in how well you can accomplish what you're trying to do. It just worked very well, and my strong recommendation to Governor Inslee would be to always bring in and inform the two parties in the legislature. You never know when the legislature is going to switch majorities, and you want to work with all four caucuses because it's important to do so, and informing them is a whole lot smarter than leaving them out.
So Governor Inslee, just give bipartisanship a chance. As Governor Evans has shown, it can actually make a positive difference. Governor Evans, I mentioned Jim Ellis, the great Jim Ellis, and the forward thrust movement in my opening. There was also in that time frame a political reform movement in King County and another one in Seattle. In what ways was our state politically innovating to get through that immediate crisis, the Boeing bust, to come out the other side better? We talked about the innovation in the economy, but what kind of political innovation was happening, and how did that look to you as governor?
Well, during all of that time, starting really with before I became governor, and going all the way through the next 40 years, Jim Ellis, who I think was one of the absolutely unique, top-ranked citizen that you could find. He devoted his time not only to his legal profession, but also to making his community a better community. And it was really, it started with his attempt to recognize his brother who fought in World War II and was killed just before the end of the war. And Jim was devastated by losing his brother, but turned that into a devotion to public service, which absolutely changed the whole state of Washington.
I think when we were talking earlier, I asked you how you came up with your ideas, how leaders came up with their ideas to solve the Boeing bust and related issues. And I think you said there was no playbook. So when you're in a situation where there's no playbook, how did you do it? How did you find the things that worked?
Well, you had to try things quickly because the crash was already on top of us. We were losing jobs at a horrendous rate each month. The surpluses we had in our unemployment compensation field turned into deep debt very quickly. We had support from our two senators, Senator Jackson and Magnuson, who were senior senators in the majority and were very willing to help to the degree they could. But ultimately, in fact, in one speech I gave, I said, look, we are only going to get out of this if we pull our socks up and figure out how to get back to a more positive future. We can't just depend on someone else. We can't just keep asking the federal government for help. They gave us all they could, but we had to do a lot more than that. I asked for a bill called Jobs Now, which was aimed at really doing what we could to, as rapidly as possible, do the necessary approvals, getting new businesses started, new or businesses who were willing and who could expand at that time. And it required changing the law to give me unusual power to move. And the legislature was very reticent to do that. But ultimately, by working with all four caucuses and their leadership, we got them to agree. In this one instance, they said, okay, we understand that we're in deep trouble. We need to get out of it together, and we need the leadership you can give us to get there. And it did work remarkably well. They gave me power to move quickly. The response was terrific. We got jobs, new businesses started faster than we thought we could. And that was the beginning of recovery. And it was done here in the state of Washington by Washingtonians and not by just sitting around waiting for somebody else to bail us out.
Just kind of in a wrap-up way, is there anything else we can learn from the Boeing bust, from that experience, that will potentially help us deal with the COVID-19 crisis?
Well, sure. The Boeing bust happened quickly and unexpectedly almost for most citizens, but it quickly involved virtually everyone, because not only were more than 100,000 people let go at Boeing, but that translated into small businesses and retail establishments having deep difficulties, many of them going under as a result of the Boeing crash. So the billboard you showed earlier of, will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights, was in many respects the turning point. It happened at the depths of our recession. And I think that I heard it repeated many, many times. People really use that almost as a kick in the pants to get started, to do what we could to create our own recovery. And the recovery happened pretty rapidly. And it was the efforts of an awful lot of people, not only in the business community, the labor unions and the workers, everybody really took part in the remarkable effort working together. Although there were plenty of problems as we went along, but basically it was, everybody had the same thing in mind, which was to recover our economy and create a better future. And I think in many respects, that's sort of equivalent to today's problem, everybody working together to put the COVID-19 problem behind us and recover as rapidly as possible to the remarkable economy we had before this all came about.
I always think of that image of a pioneer barn raising, where the whole community comes together and works to raise, a barn that they've cut out of logs, pioneer.
Yep.
And it takes everyone to help to raise that barn. And then when the next family needs a barn next season, they all come together to raise that barn. And
Sure.
that sort of pioneer spirit of coming together, which is what I think we need now. Obviously, people are going to disagree on issues. That's going to happen. But we're going to need everyone to come together, Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, Independents, in order to get through this crisis. And it sounds like that's what you were able to accomplish as governor. And we tell these stories in part because we can learn from them, and in part because I hope that it gives others hope that, as dark as it seems right now for many, we've been here before. Each crisis is different, but we have what it takes in this state, in our communities, to get through this together, and perhaps even to come out the other side better. And that's really the point of these discussions that we're having.
There may be a time for rampant partisanship, but it certainly isn't now. Quite the contrary. This is a time for, in fact, I see signs all over and frequently right now, and you have too, I'm sure everybody has. We'll get through this together. And that's exactly where we should be. And it's time to put partisanship aside, get everybody working on this in the same way. And that's the way we'll recover the fastest and the best.
Now, Governor Evans, one of the decisions that you made when you were governor, kind of in that period we're talking about after the Boeing bust, but before the full recovery, was to invite refugees from Southeast Asia to our state when they were shunned by many other states, including California. Why did you think that was the right thing to do for our state at that point in time?
Well, it was, we were watching the last few months of the war before Saigon fell, and I watched in fact, we watched the video of the people trying desperately to get into the American embassy or get somewhere where they could flee the country because they were afraid of what was going to happen. And the next thing I heard, I went to the office one morning shortly afterwards, and some of the staff captured me right away and said, "Have you heard what Governor Jerry Brown in California is doing?" And I said, "No." And he said, "We've got enough problems in California." He even tried to get the first airplane of refugees coming to California diverted to another state so they wouldn't even land in California. And they did, and now there were an increasing number of them housed at Camp Pendleton in California. And I said, that is absolutely wrong. And I sent Ralph Monroe, who at that time was a young intern in my office, and he went to Camp Pendleton and invited people to come to Washington to settle. And interestingly enough, I think probably half of the people when they heard Washington thought Washington, D.C., but quite a few volunteered. These were people who were in a land 10,000 miles away from their home, no money, nothing but the clothes on their back. And we started a program of asking people in the state to be sponsors. And we tried to get sponsors for every family that landed in the state of Washington. It took about 3 months for us to stop that program because we had so many volunteers. We just knew that there were more than enough to handle refugees that were coming to Washington State. And I think that's one of the things that helped make it work so well. We invited them to come to Washington State. We were pleased that so many did. And every family that came had a sponsoring family from Washington who volunteered to help them. In a number of cases, they invited them to come and live in their homes for up to 6 months until they could get settled. So it was a remarkable citizen effort. And I was never more proud of Washington people than I was at that time.
Well, now we're going to get a chance to meet one of those refugees who you invited into our state, France Hoang. France, are you with us?
I am, Mike. Hi, how are you doing tonight?
Good, France. Good to see you. France is in the nation's capital with his wife and I think his 3 young children. How are things going for you during the pandemic here?
Well, we're doing our best to meet the moment. Like many families, we're figuring out a new normal, which includes being a stay-at-home spouse / parent / school teacher / homemaker / entrepreneur all at the same time. For me and my wife, our startups include 3 kids under the age of 6, which is a a lot of chaos at times. If you'd asked me a year ago what would be our biggest challenge with 3 kids, I would never have guessed global pandemic. But as John Lennon once said, life's what happens to you while you're busy making other plans.
Great. And just, can you give us a little bit of the backstory about how your family came to Washington State?
Sure, Mike. I was born in Saigon in 1973. My mother, by 1975, was working for the U.S. Naval Attaché. My father was a officer in the South Vietnamese Army. And in April of 1975, a U.S. official came to my mom and says, now is the time for you and your family to leave Vietnam. And so that same day, we boarded an Air Force C-141 Starlifter and flew out of Saigon to Guam. And that was me, my younger sister, both my parents, luckily, and my father's mother. From Guam, after a stay of a few weeks, we flew to Camp Pendleton, California, right around the same time, in fact, that later Secretary Monroe would come and visit. And we were one of the families that ended up in Washington State, benefited from the programs that Governor Evans described, and benefited from the generosity of a sponsor family. The Petersons, located just outside of Olympia, took all of us in, and we stayed with them for quite a while until we got on our feet and ended up settling in Tumwater, Washington.
You have behind you a lot of pictures of a lot of famous people, including looks like a jaw of a dinosaur, maybe a T-Rex, and then next to it, a picture of Theodore Roosevelt, sometimes also referred to as T-Rex. But I understand you might have a picture of Dan Evans and Ralph Monroe kicking around there somewhere. I
do. It's just over my shoulder right here.
Yeah, so they're in your pantheon, just below the T-Rex, it looks like. I think I read somewhere that part of your motivation for service to our country and community is your appreciation for the opportunities you were given as a refugee. And I think you said you went to West Point. Can you tell us about your public service after your time at West Point?
Sure. Growing up in Washington State, I learned about my family's history. I learned about the sacrifice of veterans who had served in Vietnam. I really felt that I had a debt I wanted to repay to the country in general and the military in particular. And I thought, what better way to repay it than to serve in the military itself? So attended West Point after receiving an appointment there, graduated, and then served on active duty for 5 years as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army, including service as a peacekeeper in Bosnia. After 5 years, left the Army, went to law school, became a lawyer in Washington, D.C., held a number of legal jobs up to and including being a special assistant to President George W. Bush and a member of his White House counsel's office. And then after his administration, because I have a pretty poorly developed sense of self-preservation, actually came back onto service in the Army, recommissioned, and served in Afghanistan as a captain at the age of 35 with a U.S. Army Special Forces company deployed along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, and came back from that and began my next career, which is that as an entrepreneur.
I understand that we have some late arriving pictures from you, and I'm not sure exactly what we received, but can we see one that relates to his military service? What do we got here? There we go.
Yeah, so this is me after a patrol along the Afghanistan Pakistan border. That's dust in my beard, so I don't pull off that quite well of a Mr. Miyagi imitation most days.
And I don't know what other picture. Did you have another one that you wanted us to show there? I don't know what we've got here. Josh, what else have we got here?
Oh yes, that's a photo of me at Camp Pendleton, California, probably right around the same time that Ralph Monroe came and visited.
And then there was one of the, was that one of the White House? There we go.
Yeah, this is me. One of the things that President Bush did was have each of the an opportunity for each of the families of the folks who worked from the White House come and spend a couple minutes in the Oval Office just before we left at the end of his administration. And so one of my proudest moments was being able to take my parents and particularly my grandmother into the Oval Office.
Now, you said that when you were in the White House, you spent some time working on the president's pandemic plan, which is now getting some after-the-fact praise for its foresight. I know you don't want to comment on any political decisions that are being made today, but is there anything you learned from that time you spent looking and working on that pandemic plan so many years ago that might benefit us today?
Yes, during my time in the White House, I was one of actually 2 lawyers that supported the work of the Homeland Security Council, which had issued the National Strategy for Pandemic Influenza in 2005 and then coordinated implementation of that strategy until 2009. That work was led by visionaries like Dr. Bob Kadlik and Dr. Rajiv Venkaya, and together they put together a pretty comprehensive plan that sought to prepare the country for another pandemic like the 1918 flu pandemic, which we've heard so much about recently. In fact, one of the iconic images of the US response to COVID-19 of flattening the curve, we've all seen that graph, actually appeared for the first time in a 2007 CDC paper that was published as part of their work. That paper also explained quite accurately that in the absence of vaccines and other pharmaceutical interventions, we'd have to end up relying on things that we are now familiar with: social distancing, contact tracing, isolation, and quarantine as the interim measures until we had a vaccine. And the paper also concluded, I think pretty presciently, that every level of government, the private sector, and private citizens would all have an important role to play in responding to and recovering from a pandemic.
And just to close off on the White House story, in serving in the White House under President George W. Bush, did you come away with any lessons of leadership that you've applied or that might be useful for us today in dealing with this the pandemic?
Yes, put simply, vision and values matter. President Bush's definition of leadership is one that I also believe in. He said that a great leader is someone who has vision, who knows where they want to go, and is able to define a set of principles that enables a more successful journey. And during my time in the White House, I saw firsthand the power of his optimism and belief in a better tomorrow, and the importance he placed on assembling the right team to achieve that vision. I have no doubt, Mike, that once elected, you'll do the same.
Well, thank you. And I guess just in closing, before we get to some questions here, France, do you have any ideas based on your leadership and your years as an entrepreneur and your kind of lifelong experience on things you think we can do to address or to use COVID-19 and the crisis to maybe begin addressing some of our longstanding issues in this country?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that question in a kind of big picture way, Mike. First, this pandemic is the first common foe we've faced as a nation since 9/11. And the first foe that we've faced since World War II, where every single citizen can play a role in victory. There's been a lot that's divided us as a nation in the last few years, but COVID-19 is a common enemy of us all. That's not to say there won't be issues that need to be debated and where reasonable people can disagree. But in the midst of those debates and disagreements, we shouldn't forget who our true enemy is. And that enemy doesn't care what our political ideology is, what resonates on social media or cable news, or even who wins the next election. To defeat that enemy, we're going to have to be equally ruthless, but equally ruthless in being united against it, despite what appears to be our differences. Second, life's going to eventually return to normal, but it's going to be a new normal. We have the opportunity now to make that new normal better than the old normal. America was once faced with a global fight where we became the arsenal of democracy, and the resulting economic boom lasted decades. We now need to become the arsenal of innovation and produce a new normal with opportunities for everyone, but especially those who have been hardest hit by this pandemic.
Okay, well, thank you. And now I promised you each a chance to ask each other a question if you have one, and maybe even to fire one at me. But I'll start with you, France. You have his picture on your wall. Governor Evans was instrumental in bringing you to this country. I know you've met before, so this isn't like reality TV. But do you have a question or a comment you want to share with Governor Evans?
Yes, Governor Evans, first, honored to be here speaking with Mike Vaska with you. In my research about that time, I was struck by how much public sentiment there was at the time against the immigration of the Vietnamese people. You relayed the story about Governor Brown, but I saw that there was a poll at the time that only 35% of Americans supported the immigration. What advice do you have for today's political leaders who often have to make tough decisions in the face of public opinion or at their own political peril?
Well, there's, I think that in issues of this magnitude that really go beyond the ordinary, almost always requires an attempt to bring people together rather than to divide them. We've got plenty of other issues where we divide, and it's probably okay, but not when we are facing a crisis, either like at the end of the Vietnam War or particularly now, whereas was said earlier, the virus respects no one. The virus is bipartisan. The virus is something that we must, if we're halfway smart, we've got to face this as much together as we can. And that would be my advice all the way through to political leadership of both parties. And we have a divided government. We've got one house controlled by Democrats, one by Republicans, Republican president. But that in itself means that you've got to get together to get anything effectively accomplished. And what we're trying to accomplish now couldn't be more bipartisan or more universal, is to try to find ways to get through the threat of the COVID virus in the best way we can, and to create a new, better future for all of us with this one threat, at least, behind us. And I don't see enough of that happening yet.
Okay, Dan, it's your turn. Do you have a question for France or for me?
Well,
and you can hear him here. Sorry about that. This is a Facebook Live event, and we're doing it from our home.
Well, it's here I sit isolated. We're on our last crossword or our last jigsaw puzzle, so they better come to a conclusion to this sometime soon. I'm accustomed to the various challenges we had when I was governor. They were environmental challenges. They were economic challenges. There were racial challenges. All of them really were faced, and the results were better because we tried to work together. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But when it worked, the results ended up better. I don't know what I don't know, France, from your, it's a somewhat different perspective, but from the time you've been in Washington State, you have a pretty clear view, I think, of our political system, the backs and forths that we've gone through, and where we are now. We've come as a state to a pretty remarkable economy, interrupted by the COVID virus, but nonetheless one of the strongest states in terms of its modern economy. And I guess from your perspective, which is very different from mine and very worthwhile, because you have somewhat additional views or areas that you come from in terms of gaining a perspective. How does that, how do you view the, kind of where we are politically and where we should be politically, I guess, or how do you involve yourself politically?
Yeah, so one of the things I really, really cherished from my childhood at Washington State was being exposed to a variety of viewpoints. I'm a result of 12 years of public schooling, Tumwater School District, and I still remember the great debates and conversations and viewpoints. And having lived all around the world and in DC, I've come to realize how special that it actually is. And in the years that I've since then known Mike Vaska and been acquainted with the work of the mainstream Republicans, I think Washington State has something particularly special here with the mainstream Republicans. And Governor Evans, you are both a leader in the heart and soul and a role model for the kind of governing that Washington State is capable of, and men like Mike Vaska will produce once elected. I think we need to continue that course. There will always be headwinds and people who, bring a different message, but I think we need to stay true to that. I think that in an era of social media, it can be easy to get distracted by, and also 24-hour cable, right? Be distracted by sound bites and fast headlines. But I think the voters of Washington State and the people I know are thoughtful, are thinking people. They appreciate nuance. And I think they realize that the hard decisions, it's easy to take staunch positions that are black and white, but the reality is governing occurs in the gray, in the middle, where those things meet. And that applies to politics, that applies to business, that applies to raising kids. And so I welcome further debate and discussion with thoughtful people from across the political spectrum.
Well, it's
Okay,
just, it's terribly important,
Go ahead, Dan.
it seems to me, for all of us to be involved politically. That's, the most countries, if you read, I'm an avid history reader, and you read the history of most nations, and they were formed and developed either by conquest, by royalty, but rare are those who began with an idea. And I think that's where the United States, we owe a lot to the geniuses who created the Constitution and who gave us the political system we now operate under. And if I get mad at anybody, it's usually those who take it for granted and figure that they don't even need to vote. They can, but they don't realize that what they are. And if running this country was like a game of football, all they're doing is sitting on the bench and not taking part. And the one thing that keeps this country strong and will keep us strong in the future is to have people who care, who are involved, and who not only vote regularly, but people who take part in campaigns and help foster the new ideas that keep us going. It's sort of easy to say, but I think it's unfortunate that too many of us just take things for granted. We don't vote. That doesn't mean we don't complain. We just we don't vote, but that doesn't seem to keep us from commenting on what's going on. And I think if you, unless you're really an active participant, unless you're voting and caring for what goes on in government and making sure it's going right, you're not doing your full share as a citizen. And that's why I've, people on occasion have said, well, you're just a politician. And I said, you're darn right I am. And everybody ought to be a politician, because if you look in the dictionary and you see what's the definition of politics? Politics is the art and science of government. That's the first, in my 1,300-page dictionary, that's the first definition. And so if you're going to be a politician, you're a practitioner of the art and science of government. And every citizen under that definition ought to be a politician, to be engaged in doing what they can to make government work as well as it can, because that's to their benefit, it's to everybody's benefit. I guess that's my sermon on politics.
Well, we're getting toward the end of our time, and I did promise you both an opportunity to ask me a question if you have one. That doesn't mean you have to have one. We do have one from a viewer, but did you have something you wanted to ask me? And for those of you watching, we have not rehearsed this, so I have no idea if they're going to ask me what the question is.
Well, Mike, just tell me what is your view of the job you're seeking as Attorney General of the state of Washington? As governor, I had Democratic Attorney General and Republican Attorney General, and I found out very quickly that they are independent of the governor. And that makes their job an extraordinarily important one. But how would you carry it out? What would you do, and where do you think we need to modify what we are doing now?
Well, Rob McKenna says that it's the second most powerful job in state government because of that independence. And I've talked to others who didn't realize that and then found out the hard way that the Attorney General is independent of the governor. There is a great tradition of that office operating in a professional and a nonpartisan way, even though obviously the Attorney General is elected and is from one party or the other. The office, the day-to-day operations of the office have been viewed as nonpartisan and professional. And there's a pretty widely held view that that has changed with the current Attorney General. And he is focused more on partisan issues and more on national issues. So in a kind of shorthand way, I'll answer your question, Dan, by saying I would bring professionalism back to the office. Of course, I've been a professional lawyer for 30 years. I've been very involved in politics, in elections, so I am very experienced there, but I am a professional lawyer first. And I will refocus the office on problems here at home, which is even, I was saying that even before COVID-19, but that just becomes critical now. The attention of the office, which has a great power to convene constituencies around the state to solve problems like homelessness, that needs to be focused like a laser on solving the problems we have here at home. And I can elaborate and go in more detail, but we're running out of time. One of our viewers asked me to compare and contrast my style of leadership as demonstrated over the last 30 years with that of the current Attorney General. And I would say my style of leadership, and Dan, you were my mentor, and I learned a lot of this from you, is to bring people together, even if it looks like it is impossible at the outset to get people to agree. You have to at least try, and you're often so surprised at the ability to bring people together and find consensus. The current Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, is, of course, very partisan. I really believe in the power of we versus the approach where it's us versus them. And even beyond the political context, even in my professional career, and you see behind me, I think, a soccer picture of Grant's soccer team where everyone's huddled up. That's how we approached soccer. You know, it was us, it was a team, it was we. Even our opponents were not our enemies, they were our opponents. They were there to make us better by giving us competition. So that's my approach, and I really think that's the approach that is going to be so essential as our state enters one of its most difficult times of challenge that perhaps we've ever seen. So, France, I don't want to miss an opportunity. If you had a burning question for me.
No, Mike, I'll yield the time back to you. I know we're short on time, so. Okay.
Well, unless either of you have anything else, I want to thank you both for joining us. Dan, of course, is an old friend. France, I've only known you for a couple of years now. Obviously, super impressed by everything you've done, and you're such a great example of what our state's generosity means for what I call new Americans. I'll close by saying this year's elections may be the most important in generations. If we choose leadership over partisanship, if we elect leaders who are equipped by their experience and temperament to take on tough challenges, history can repeat itself and we can overcome this crisis like we have before. We can build a better state and better communities in the process. I'm running for Attorney General to use my decades of experience bringing people together to solve tough challenges. Now, as Dan says, please get off the bench and participate this year, and do so by visiting my website at mikevasca.com. And if you like this event, please consider making a donation to my campaign to help pay for it. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to my wife, Camille, and my son, Grant, who are here, and also to Josh Amoto, who's behind the camera. Thank you again, France and Governor Evans, for joining us. For now, we'll say goodbye, but tune in next week at 4 o'clock on Sunday, and we'll have another edition of our Facebook Live event. Thank you very much.